has returned.
God of War 3 is the rousing conclusion to Sony's God of War trilogy, which began 5 years ago on the PlayStation 2. And to give this series the epic send-off it deserves, Sony's Santa Monica studio has given God of War 3 plenty of lavish trimmings, from its stunning graphics to its incredible sense of scope. It's a lot of fun to barbarically ravage your demoniacal foes in what feels like the physical manifestations of a Slayer lyric, but the truth is, if you peel away those aesthetic charms, there's really nothing new or inventive happening in God of War 3. It may break plenty of skulls and rain blood from a lacerated sky, but it doesn't break any ground. So if you were expecting new tricks from Kratos, this decidedly familiar grand finale may disappoint you. Of course, if you're expecting new tricks from Kratos, this game probably isn't meant for you in the first place. God of War 3 doesn't break ground because God of War 3 doesn't really need to, and it's unequivocal proof that sometimes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is the best way to approach sequel development. Especially when the series in question is as badass as God of War. Players control the warrior Kratos, a captain in the Spartan army who was deceived by the god Ares into murdering his wife and daughter. Armed with a deadly pair of whip-like blades, Kratos has sought revenge against the gods of Olympus since the series began, and in God of War 3, it's up to you to finally exact that revenge in the most brutal and heinous ways imaginable. Like its two predecessors, God of War 3 is very much a prototypical hack-and-slash action game at its core. You'll run around linear environments based on the mythos of ancient Greece, while slicing up enemies with your blades, and, if you're so inclined, ripping them in half with your bare hands. Like most games in this genre, God of War 3 is all about the combat, but ironically, the combat is also what makes God of War unique. It emphasizes being as vicious as possible, stringing together horrifically bloody combos and basking in the glory of gratuitous violence. God of War 3 is all about gratuitous violence. Of course, most of this grotesque bloodshed is caused by just hammering buttons. Players can execute a light attack by pressing the square button, or a heavy attack by pressing the triangle, and pressing combinations of these buttons in sequence can trigger even more powerful melee attacks, which sort of has a fighting game feel to it. Kratos can also perform some ridiculously brutal attacks on larger enemies and bosses by completing QuickTime events. And although I personally detest in-game button prompts like this, they're used pretty effectively in God of War 3. They trigger some of the game's most brutal kills, and by pairing the entertainment value of their savagery with the uniqueness of the way Kratos dispatches each foe, they never feel like the generic cop-outs they've devolved into in most games. Obviously, there isn't much intricacy to the game's controls, and it's easy to understand why the game's detractors might brush it off as just another button masher. As much as the game does to keep things interesting and break from the monotony seemingly inherent with hack-and-slash games of this nature, God of War 3 can't escape that fate entirely. Despite its epic story and setting, and the Metalocalypse-like hilarity of its totally brutal brutality, the game does eventually feel a bit repetitive. Still, the gameplay certainly isn't tedious enough to detract from the overall experience. God of War 3 grabs your attention from its opening scenes, and it doesn't release its suffocating death grip until the credits roll. And believe me, credits aren't the only things that roll in this game. God of War 3 may not be something new, but it's definitely something awesome. A polished, refined, and testosterone-infused recital of established gaming conventions, easily among the best experiences your PS3 has to offer this year.